June 6, 1944. D-Day. On the coast of France, American paratroopers have just captured a bewildering prisoner. He's wearing the uniform of a German soldier, but his face is Asian. He doesn't speak a word of German. And as his story slowly unravels, it seems utterly impossible. His tale is one of survival forced upon him across 9 long years. It's a journey that would see him conscripted into 3 different armies and forced to fight on 3 different sides of the deadliest war in human history. This is the unbelievable story of the soldier without a country, Kyoungjong. To understand how Kyoungjong's impossible journey began, we must first travel back to the Korean peninsula in the 1930s. This was not a sovereign nation but a colony of the Empire of Japan, annexed in 1910. For nearly 3 decades, Korea lived under a harsh and systematic occupation. The Japanese imperial project sought to assimilate Koreans completely, suppressing their language, their culture, and their very identity. Korean families were forced to adopt Japanese names, and Korean resources were funneled to fuel Japan's expanding war machine. It was into this world of subjugation and control that Kyoungjong was born, an ordinary young man coming of age in an extraordinarily difficult time. His early life, like that of most Koreans, was shaped by the realities of colonial rule. Opportunities were scarce, and the future was largely dictated by the demands of the occupying power. As a teenager, he would have witnessed the increasing militarization of society and the growing drumbeat of Japan's ambitions on the Asian continent. The concept of choice was a luxury most Koreans did not possess. Their lives were subject to the decrees of a distant emperor in Tokyo. Yang was just one of millions, caught in the currents of a history far larger than himself, his personal dreams and aspirations secondary to the geopolitical forces reshaping the world. The turning point arrived in 1938. As Japan deepened its brutal war in China, its need for manpower became insatiable. The Imperial Japanese Army, which had previously relied on voluntary enlistment from its colonies, formally instituted a conscription policy for Korean men. This was not an invitation to serve. It was a forcible seizure. At the age of just 18, Kyoungjong was taken from his home and his family. He was given a uniform, a rifle, and a one-way ticket to the front lines. His destination was the Kyoungjong Army, the formidable Japanese force stationed in the puppet state of Manchukuo, modern-day Manchuria. This assignment was particularly significant. The Kyoungjong Army was not just any military unit. It was the vanguard of Japanese imperial ambition, positioned on the volatile border with the Soviet Union. Tensions between Japan and the USSR were high, with frequent and bloody border skirmishes flaring up in the contested territories. For a young conscript like Yang, this was the worst possible posting. He was not a volunteer fighting for a cause he believed in. He was a forced laborer in uniform, sent to the most dangerous and politically charged frontier of the Japanese Empire. His value in the eyes of his commanders was minimal. He was a disposable asset, a body to fill a trench and slow an enemy advance. The first and most pivotal transformation of his identity was now complete. Kyoungjong, the Korean civilian, had become a soldier of Imperial Japan, setting in motion a chain of events that would defy all belief. Kyoungjong's time with the Kyoungjong Army was brutally short-lived. The remote border between Manchuria and Mongolia was a tinderbox, and in 1939 it erupted into a full-scale, though largely undeclared war. The Battle of Kyoungjong was a massive and bloody conflict that pitted the military might of Japan against the rising power of the Soviet Union under General Georgy Zhukov. It was a showcase of brutal, industrialized warfare, featuring tens of thousands of troops, tanks, and aircraft clashing in a vicious struggle for dominance. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a hellish experience of constant artillery barrages, tank assaults, and close-quarters combat in a desolate landscape. The Japanese forces, including their Korean conscripts, were decisively defeated, suffering catastrophic losses. In the chaotic aftermath of the battle, as units were shattered and communication lines collapsed, Yang found himself among the thousands of dazed and defeated soldiers rounded up by the victorious Red Army. His war as a Japanese soldier was over, but his ordeal was only beginning. His capture meant a transition from one form of hell to another. As a prisoner of war of the Soviets, he was stripped of his identity once again, now becoming a mere number in the vast and merciless Soviet penal system. The initial processing was likely a blur of disorientation and fear, but the true nature of his new existence soon became clear. He was transported to a gulag, the network of forced labor camps that spanned the harsh, unforgiving expanse of the Soviet Union. These camps were engineered for destruction through work, where prisoners were subjected to brutal cold, starvation rations, and backbreaking labor with primitive tools. The average life expectancy in such a place was measured in seasons, not years. It was a fate designed to break both body and spirit, a slow, grinding death sentence for those deemed enemies of the state. It was in this desperate context that a grim and cynical choice emerged, one that would alter the course of Yang's life for a second time. Facing almost certain death in the camps, prisoners of war were often presented with an offer. They could continue to languish and die as laborers, or they could volunteer to join the Red Army. This was not an offer made in good faith. It was a coercive tactic to replenish the USSR's own staggering manpower losses. For a young man like Yang, clinging to survival in a system that valued him less than the timber he cut or the rocks he mined, the decision was a simple calculation between certain death and probable death. Choosing the latter, he exchanged his prisoner's rags for a Soviet uniform, becoming a soldier in the very army that had captured him. This was not a path to redemption or a fresh start. Men like Yang were not trusted. They were often placed in penal battalions, known as Strafbats, which were used as disposable units for the most dangerous tasks on the front lines. These included suicidal frontal assaults, clearing minefields by marching through them, and holding untenable positions. Service in a penal battalion was essentially a delayed death sentence, a chance to be killed in combat rather than to die of starvation and exposure in a camp. For young Kyoungjong, his world had now inverted completely. The soldier who had been forced to fight for the Japanese Empire was now a forced conscript for the Soviet Union, sent to the meat grinder of the Eastern Front to fight against the German Wehrmacht. He had survived one world-shattering conflict at Kyoungjong, only to be thrown into another, even larger one, his life once again expendable in the grand and terrible strategies of empires at war. If the battle at Kyoungjong was hell, then the Eastern Front was an abyss of unimaginable scale and savagery. By the time young Kyoungjong was thrust into this conflict, it had become the largest and most brutal theater of war in human history, a colossal struggle between two totalitarian regimes that showed no mercy to their own soldiers, let alone the enemy. The battles here, such as the Third Battle of Kharkov in early 1943, were exercises in industrial-scale slaughter, where entire armies could be encircled and annihilated in a matter of days. The landscape was a charred wasteland of frozen trenches, burning villages, and countless unmarked graves. For a soldier in a Soviet penal battalion, the situation was particularly dire. These units were deliberately placed at the most vulnerable points of the front, used as cannon fodder to absorb the full force of German assaults, reveal enemy positions, or clear minefields with their own bodies. Life expectancy was measured in weeks. It was in one of these chaotic, bloody engagements, as his unit was inevitably overrun, shattered, and destroyed, that Yang's war took another incredible turn. For the second time in his young life, he found himself on the losing side of a battle, surrendering to the advancing German Wehrmacht and becoming a prisoner of war once more. His capture by the Germans presented a new and equally grim reality. As a Soviet soldier, he was considered Untermensch, subhuman, by Nazi ideology, and the treatment of Soviet POWs was systematically barbaric. Millions would die from deliberate starvation, disease, and exposure in makeshift camps that were little more than open-air death pits. For Yang, survival now meant navigating this fresh nightmare. It was within this desperate context that he encountered the German practice of utilizing Hilfswillige, or Highwis, a term meaning those willing to help. This was often a grotesque misnomer, as the willingness was typically coerced by the specter of a slow, agonizing death in captivity. Faced with this stark choice, the line between collaboration and survival blurred into non-existence. For a man who had already been a conscript for two opposing armies, the moral calculus was numbingly familiar. To avoid starvation and execution, he once again accepted a uniform, this time becoming an auxiliary for the German war machine. This decision led to his formal incorporation into the German military structure through the Ostlegionen, or Eastern Legions. These were military units composed of Soviet prisoners of war and other volunteers from the occupied territories of the USSR, primarily used for non-combat support roles to free up German troops for the front lines. However, as the war dragged on and Germany's manpower crisis deepened, these units were increasingly used for secondary combat duties. Kyoungjong, now a soldier of the Third Reich, was swept up in the German strategic redeployment. In early 1944, as the High Command braced for an anticipated Allied invasion in the West, entire divisions were transferred from the Eastern Front to fortify the Atlantic Wall. Kyoungjong's unit was among them. He was shipped thousands of miles away from the frozen steppes of Russia to the rolling fields and coastal villages of Normandy, France. Here, he was tasked with manning defensive positions, a Korean man in a German uniform, digging trenches on the French coast to defend against an attack from the British and Americans. From the plains of Manchuria to the forests of Russia, and now to the shores of Normandy, young Kyoungjong had been a pawn in a global conflict, his life a testament to the relentless, dehumanizing machinery of a world at war. The dawn of June 6, 1944, unleashed a storm of steel and fire upon the Normandy coast. For young Kyoungjong, stationed in his defensive position inland, the long-anticipated invasion began not with the sight of ships, but with the deafening roar of aircraft and the sudden, chaotic appearance of enemy paratroopers descending from the sky. The carefully maintained static front of the Atlantic Wall dissolved in an instant into a maelstrom of confusion, with fierce firefights erupting in the hedgerows, fields, and villages of the French countryside. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had been dropped behind enemy lines with orders to secure key points and disrupt German communications, and they engaged with ferocious intensity. For the German defenders, and particularly for the auxiliary troops of the Ostlegionen, the situation was one of sheer bedlam. Isolated from their command structure and overwhelmed by the sheer audacity and violence of the airborne assault, many units were cut off, surrounded, and forced to surrender within the first critical hours of the invasion. It was in this context of disarray and sudden defeat that Kyoungjong's incredible odyssey reached its climax. As American paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the famed 101st Airborne, swept through their objectives, they began rounding up prisoners. Among the countless German soldiers captured that day was one who immediately stood out as an anomaly. He was an Asian man, wearing the uniform of the Wehrmacht. His capture was likely unceremonious, a figure emerging from a trench or a bunker, hands raised, surrendering to the victorious Americans. He was disarmed and herded with other prisoners, but his distinct appearance immediately marked him for further investigation. He was a puzzle on a battlefield that was already the most complex military operation in history. The subsequent interrogation must have been a scene of profound bewilderment. The American soldiers and intelligence officers faced a man with whom they had no common language. He did not speak English or German with any fluency that could explain his situation. The immediate, logical assumption for the Allied interrogators was that he was a Japanese soldier, a special attachment to German forces, perhaps as a military observer or a liaison. This, in itself, would have been a significant intelligence find, evidence of the direct Axis cooperation they had long suspected. But as translators were found and a painstaking, halting dialogue began, a far more incredible story started to emerge. The narrative that unfolded was not one of ideological commitment or high-level strategy, but of repeated conscription, capture, and survival. He spoke not of Japan, but of Korea. He mentioned not just the German army, but the Soviet Red Army and the Imperial Japanese Army before that. The initial skepticism of his captors must have been immense. His claims seemed like the desperate fabrications of a man trying to avoid execution as a collaborator. A soldier who had fought for all three major Axis powers and the Soviets. It sounded like a fantastical lie. Yet, as his story remained consistent under questioning and as the pieces were slowly put together, his age, his origins, the timelines of his conscription and captures, The sheer, staggering truth of it began to sink in. They were not looking at a fanatical enemy, but at one of the war's most profound and tragic victims. A man without a country, who had been chewed up and spat out by the war machines of 3 different empires. His capture on D-Day was not an end, but merely the final bewildering transfer in a 9-year journey that had taken him across the entire globe, a living symbol of the war's absurdity and its relentless consumption of ordinary human lives. Following his capture on the beaches of Normandy, young Kyoungjong entered the Allied prisoner of war system, a final bewildering transition in a life defined by them. He was initially processed and, like countless other German prisoners, shipped across the English Channel to a POW camp in Britain. His unique status, however, continued to generate confusion and interest. He was a singular anomaly in a vast bureaucratic system, a man who defied all standard classifications. This likely led to his subsequent transfer to a camp in the United States, where he could be further questioned and his extraordinary story more thoroughly documented, far from the immediate pressures of the ongoing war. For the next 3 years, as the world celebrated victory and then plunged into the tensions of the Cold War, Yang remained in captivity, a man without a nation in a world busy redrawing its borders. It wasn't until 1947, 2 years after the war's end, that he was finally granted his freedom. He was released into a world that was forever scarred by the very conflict he had been forced to endure for nearly a decade. With his release, young Kyoungjong chose the one thing that had been denied to him for so long: obscurity. He effectively vanished from all public and historical records for decades. The man who had lived one of the most documented global odysseys of the war simply disappeared into the quiet rhythms of civilian life. It is widely believed that he emigrated to the United States, the very country whose soldiers had captured him, and settled in Illinois. There, he presumably found the peace and anonymity he had been seeking, living a life far removed from the battlefields of 3 continents. He passed away in 1992, taking the full, intimate details of his incredible journey with him. His story only resurfaced publicly years later, pieced together by historians from military archives and the memories of the American veterans who had been so baffled by him that day in Normandy. Inevitably, a story this extraordinary invites a degree of historical scrutiny. Some historians have questioned specific details of Yang's narrative, pointing to the sparse and sometimes contradictory nature of the surviving military documents. The exact units he served in, the precise timelines of his transfers, these finer points are lost to the fog of war and imperfect record-keeping. However, the core astounding facts of his story are widely accepted. The documentation of his capture by the Americans on D-Day is irrefutable, and his presence in a German uniform is a matter of record. The broader historical context also lends it credibility. The forced conscription of Koreans by the Japanese, the Soviet practice of press-ganging POWs into penal battalions, and the German reliance on Ostruppen are all well documented. While the precise path may be debated, the journey itself is not. Young Kyoungjong was a real man who lived an almost impossibly dramatic life. Ultimately, his legacy transcends the mere facts and dates. Young Kyoungjong's story is not one of heroism in the traditional sense, nor is it a tale of treachery. He was the ultimate pawn, a piece of flotsam tossed on the tidal waves of 20th century imperialism and total war. His life serves as a powerful symbol for the millions of forgotten conscripts, forced laborers, and displaced persons whose individual sufferings were erased by the grand narratives of nations and ideologies. He was a Korean forced to fight for Japan, a prisoner forced to fight for the Soviet Union, and a captive forced to fight for Germany. At no point was he ever fighting for himself or for a cause of his own choosing. His story is a profound reminder that history is not just shaped by the decisions of generals and politicians, but is also endured by ordinary individuals caught in its gears. Young Kyoungjong was a survivor, and his unbelievable odyssey stands as a timeless testament to the human capacity for endurance in the face of forces beyond any single person's control.